Okay, hello everybody. I put together this little presentation to kind of give some background on just like the structure of government, the different branches of government and powers that they have. Just for anyone who wants a little more information as we're trying to read news articles and figure out what's going on. And just for a disclaimer in the beginning, I am definitely not an expert. There are lots of gaps in my knowledge, so if you notice something I get wrong, please let me know. Just kind of take it with a grain of salt. This is my knowledge and opinions. And let's go. Hopefully it's not too boring. So, first of all, just real quick, I think it's good to clarify what kind of government we actually have in the United States. Lots of people call it a democracy. It's not exactly a democracy. So in like a direct democracy, people would be able to vote directly on laws. And we don't have that in this country. That would be like incredibly complicated for millions of people to be voting on every single law across the country. So in some states, including Utah, like 26 of the states, so about half, have like an initiative or referendum process where within the state, citizens can directly vote on some laws on the ballot. So that's kind of nice where that happens. That's like a little tiny bit of direct democracy, but other than that, we're definitely not a direct democracy. But since all citizens 18 and up have the chance to vote and elect their representatives, we're definitely influenced by democratic principles. So next, are we a republic? Yes. So that means instead of directly voting on laws, we elect legislators to create laws and a president or governor at the state level to implement those laws. And if we don't like what they do, we can vote them out of office. So the next bullet point says constitutional government. So we are a republic, but we are also governed by a constitution. So that's really special. As it says there, the elected leaders must comply with the structure and rules set forth in the Constitution. And the courts are there to arbitrate disputes that come up related to the Constitution. And another aspect of our government is that we are a federalist government. Since we're such a huge country, and ever since the beginning of the country, there were definitely debates between the states, kind of like figuring out how to balance power within the federal government between the different states. So the founders set up kind of guidelines on how power could be divided between the national government and the state governments. So in the end, we have a constitutional federal republic working under principles of democracy. That is a huge mouthful, so it's fine if you want to just call it a democracy. Okay, so on this slide, it's just a brief explanation of the three different branches of the government that are set forth in the Constitution. So the government is divided into the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. And these branches are found at both the national and state level. In this presentation, I'll be focusing mostly on just the national level. And then the Constitution also sets up like distinct roles for each of these branches and kind of checks and balances between the branches so that no one leader or no one part of the government could become too powerful. The founders were really focused on like escaping the power of the monarchy in Britain, and we didn't want to just set up another system where there could be an oppressive ruler that's doing things that the people don't like. So that's where kind of this complicated structure came to be, and it is a really good structure. So the legislative branch, I believe that the founders intended the legislative branch to hold kind of the biggest power in the government. So that's Congress. So in the picture, that is the Capitol building. And Congress is made up of two different chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and they are the ones that create laws. The executive branch is on the national level. It's the president, the vice president, and like the cabinet and different executive offices. And then on the state level, it's like the governor and lieutenant governor and the different departments and offices. And their role is to enforce the laws created by Congress. The judicial branch, and that's the White House, by the way, in the picture. The judicial branch, this picture is of the Supreme Court building in DC. So there's a court system both on the federal level and the state level. And I honestly don't know all that much about the judicial branch. It's like complicated how all the courts work and things like that. But their main role is to interpret and evaluate laws and make sure that they comply with the Constitution. So I wanted to give a few examples of kind of how these branches can work together in like creating and enforcing laws. So some laws are much more straightforward and kind of easy to implement. So for example, maybe like an infrastructure bill for the state or something. Congress might appropriate a certain amount of money to like rebuild a few roads or build a new bridge or something like that. And give a certain amount of money for that bill. And then the executive branch, so if it was on the state level, like the governor would probably have like a certain executive office in charge of transportation projects. And so that office would be the one to like actually oversee the project, to like put out bids for contractors and make sure that the road was built like within budget and in a decent time frame and to certain standards of quality and stuff like that. So that one's pretty straightforward. An example that I thought of that where there were a lot more issues and it was not so straightforward was in Utah, the transgender bathroom bill from like a year ago. So if you're not familiar with this bill, the Utah legislature passed a bill saying that in public buildings, so just like state buildings, not like private property, that people could only use the bathroom based on their sex assigned at birth. Same with like locker rooms as well. And this especially causes problems for like public school students. So anyway, there's a lot of controversy about this bill, but it ended up passing, and they put in there like a clause that if there were like institutions like a school or something that they were not complying and there had been complaints, after a 30-day window, they would be fined like $10,000 a day for not complying. So they were trying to like put in there this big fine for not complying with the law, but in reality, it's like very difficult to actually implement this law and like, police the bathrooms. Anyway, it ended up being pretty funny. Like I was happy when the news articles came out, like after this law went into place, because the auditor's office was the one in charge in the executive branch, like in charge of kind of enforcing this law. And they had like a complaint line or something that people were supposed to call if they noticed people using the wrong restrooms. And it was like flooded with all these fake complaints. Anyways, just ended up being kind of a joke. And being like very inefficient and expensive and didn't really work to try to enforce this law at all. So just to clarify, I don't want to make it sound like this bill doesn't matter or doesn't have a negative impact on people, because I think even if it is almost impossible to enforce something like a bathroom ban for transgender people, there still is always the fear that someone is going to report you or something. So I think almost everyone will comply with this bill, even though like the actual reporting process and everything is like very unwieldy and almost impossible for the executive branch to handle. So even also in cases like Trump's executive orders, there may be some of them that are not really enforceable, but still can, like even just by passing a law like this or making an executive order, it can still really kind of make people afraid and make them comply with things, even if there's not a way for the government to actually monitor that. And there's a similar law like this in Idaho that was actually legally challenged. So the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment protects people's rights against discrimination for different ways, and one of them is sex. So you can't be discriminated against based on sex. And so, in my opinion, this falls pretty well into that bucket. So anyways, I think it was just kind of like put on pause in Idaho. I don't know what happened with that one. But that's kind of how the three branches, like the legislature might pass a bill, but it might be like actually really difficult to implement or complicated for the executive branch to figure out how to implement that. And there might be problems that make it go to the court. Like if somebody feels like this is a violation of my constitutional rights, they can bring it to the court and try to get that law repealed for being unconstitutional. Okay, so now we're going to go through each of the branches in a little more detail, to try to help explain kind of what their powers are and like what the structure of it is. Okay, so first the legislative branch. They have the power to create laws, and also the power of the purse, which is really important. So Congress determines taxes, government spending, and borrowing. They also have the power to declare war. And the Senate can also confirm or reject presidential nominations for heads of federal agencies, federal judges, and the Supreme Court. So as I was saying before, like the legislative branch kind of has, in my opinion, the most powers given to it in the Constitution of any branch of government. Okay, structure. This is a little complicated, so bear with me. So the House, there's two different chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this is on the national level, but it's similar in each state as well. So for the national level House of Representatives, there are 435 members, and each state is given a certain number of representatives based on their population. So every 10 years when there's a census, occasionally some states lose or gain representatives based on population changes. The representatives serve 2-year terms, so pretty short terms. Each one represents about 700,000 people that's in their congressional district in their state. And then for the Senate, it's a pretty different structure. So this kind of goes back to the debates over like federalism. In the beginning of the Constitution, states wanted to be able to have power, like the smaller states didn't want to just lose power to the more populous states. And so this was kind of the compromise. The Senate has 100 members, and there's an equal 2 senators per state. And senators serve 6-year terms, so much longer terms. Within each of the chambers, the members of Congress serve on committees that specialize in certain areas. So for example, there's like an Armed Services Committee, Energy and Natural Resources, there's economics, there's like all kinds of different committees. And then just really quick, I sent out earlier like a link to the group that I'm part of. MWEG does like a presentation each year about the legislature in Utah. So that gives a lot more detail on a lot of this stuff like within the state of Utah. So I definitely recommend checking that out, or I could look and see if I have like a copy of the presentation I could send out if you haven't seen that already. But anyway, just really briefly wanted to explain, like, it's a pretty complicated process for a bill to become a law within the legislative branch. And over, like, in recent years, with so much polarization, like, it's gotten more and more difficult for members of Congress to be able to compromise with each other and be able to pass legislation. So that's been pretty frustrating. I feel like a lot of us look at Congress and just say, like, what are you doing? Like, why can't you come up with laws on things like immigration and stuff that is just kind of gridlocked and nobody can compromise? And even just like passing the budget each year, it's always like this big drawn out debate and like drama, and like trying to raise the debt limit or anything, it just becomes kind of chaos. So anyways, this is how a bill becomes a law. So first, the bill is either introduced into the House or the Senate to begin with. It's reviewed by one of those committees that we talked about, and they can either amend the bill, make changes to it, or if they don't think it's going to pass, or they think there's a lot of problems with it, they can just reject it, table it. But if the bill passes through the committee, or might be a few different committees that it has to go through, it will be debated and voted on by the full chamber, so either the House or the Senate. After it passes in that one chamber, then the bill is sent to the other chamber, and it kind of goes through that same process in the other chamber. And then the same version of the bill has to pass in both chambers before it can be sent to the president to be signed into law. So like if a bill passes the House and then goes to the Senate and gets like amended or changed, then it has to like go back to the House to see if the House will pass it, and they can have the same bill to go to the president. So it's a lot of steps. It's really complicated, but that's kind of how it happens. And also, since Congress is in charge of like the budget and appropriations, that's a big part of what they do is like appropriations bills for figuring out government spending in all the different areas of the budget. Okay, so executive branch. The main role of the executive branch is to enforce laws passed by Congress. And like we talked about earlier, that sometimes it's straightforward and sometimes it can be pretty complicated. Like if you look at the laws that are passed, like it's kind of crazy to read through. Like there's just pages and pages and pages of detailed information. Because the Congress people, they try to like kind of consider all the different possible loopholes and things, you know, like it's this crazy legal language to try to avoid any issues with it being implemented in a different way than what was intended. But anyways, still it's sometimes hard, and the president sometimes has some leeway in terms of like how they enforce those laws. The president is also in charge of conducting diplomacy and negotiating treaties, but typically the treaties need to be ratified by the Senate as well. The president serves as commander-in-chief of the military and can call out troops to protect the country. So yeah, like in both the diplomacy and the commander-in-chief role, they're supposed to work with Congress. There's kind of some leeway with that as well. So that's one of the areas where presidential powers have kind of expanded over the years. Just because it's difficult for every like negotiation with foreign countries or every military action to have to be like approved by all of Congress. Okay, the president can also appoint officials, judges, and ambassadors. They typically need to be approved by Congress as well. They can also issue executive orders to clarify implementation of laws. So we'll talk more about that later, since that has become a big issue in the first week or so of Trump's presidency, is all these executive orders. And presidents can also grant pardons and clemency for federal crimes, which we've also seen Biden and Trump very liberally using that power in their presidencies. Okay, so the structure of the executive branch, much less complicated than Congress, well, for the most part. So it's the president, the vice president, the attorney general is also kind of part of that executive branch. And then there are different executive departments and cabinet members that head those departments. So there's a list of those there. So the federal government, the executive branch has kind of grown and grown and grown over the years. Like as we've gone from this tiny country to a major world power, like you can imagine all of these agencies eventually being created as needed and then growing into these huge staffs with lots of bureaucrats. So that's a big part of the executive branch and how it functions. Okay, and then last, the judicial branch. Their role is to interpret laws, evaluate laws, apply those laws to individual cases that come before the courts, and they determine if the law violates the Constitution. Okay, so the structure of the judicial branch, we'll go through this kind of quickly. This is just like brief overview. As I said, I'm not like super familiar with this branch of the government. So one thing to note is that there are some laws that are federal laws and some laws that are state laws. So federal courts deal with federal laws and state courts deal with state laws. In both with the federal government and with the states, there are like lower district courts and state courts. Oftentimes these deal with specific types of cases like a bankruptcy court or a family court or a juvenile court. And then if someone takes a case to one of those courts and they're unsatisfied with a ruling at a lower level in the federal court, they can appeal to a U.S. Court of Appeals, which is kind of the next level up. And if they're not satisfied with that ruling, they can try to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court to review that decision. The Supreme Court only takes certain types of cases, and they're like not under any obligation to take any case. So they might just say, no, we're not going to take the case, and then the ruling from the lower court stands. So SCOTUS is kind of the acronym for the Supreme Court, and they are also the final voice on constitutionality of different laws. So the structure of the Supreme Court, there are 8 justices and then 1 chief justice, so 9 justices altogether. Justices are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and they usually serve for life. So those are really important positions, and if a president gets to appoint Supreme Court judges, that can influence laws for many, many years to come. Okay, so here is, this next slide is about checks and balances. Dan found these cute little graphics, so there you go. Anyway, so checks and balances are just like kind of ways that each branch can check the power of the other branches to make sure that no one area of government is usurping too much power. Okay, so some examples. The president can veto a law passed by Congress, but it's not an absolute veto power, because if Congress can get 2/3 support in both the House and the Senate, which is hard to do, they can override that veto. So I don't know how many times that's actually happened, but it's at least theoretically possible. Next, Okay, so Congress has the power to impeach the president and remove him from office. So as I was looking at that, I think it's the House of Representatives that passes a motion to impeach the president, and then the Senate holds a trial to determine if they're going to remove him from office. So we've seen that with President Trump and others in recent history, and no one has yet been removed from office, but it is a possibility. And I found out as I was researching this that Congress can also impeach judges and remove them from office. I didn't know that before. The judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional, so that is a big check. And the president, although he does not have power to make laws, he can issue executive orders that are similar to laws. However, the judicial branch can declare those orders unconstitutional, kind of like laws, and that's called judicial review. And then another point is Congress can also push back on those executive orders. So particularly since they're in charge of the purse, the budget, they can just withhold funding from those executive orders, and then it's pretty impossible for the executive branch to actually carry out those things if they don't have any money to do it with. Okay, so real quick, also I thought it was important to mention some unofficial checks and balances that make sure that we maintain a democratic process where ultimately the people hold the power and not any one ruler becoming too powerful. So I've heard these talked of as unofficial branches of government. I think the most important first unofficial branch is the media. And there could probably be a whole presentation just about the media. But I feel especially investigative journalism is really, really important. And there's kind of this negative view of mainstream media a lot of times, but it is important to have those actual mainstream media, I don't know what else to call it, but with actual journalists who are held to high standards, who actually have legitimate sources and do lots of checking, and if they make mistakes they go back and retract things. Anyway, I feel it's getting more and more difficult with so much news online, and especially through social media. And also it's really hard, a lot of the things out there on social media are more opinion pieces. They're not investigative journalism. They're not going to the sources and interviewing people and doing careful fact checking and things like that. It's just someone's opinion, but it can look pretty official when it's just out there on the web, if you're not careful. So I feel that one is really dangerous. If we don't have media, if we don't have reporters out there investigating corruption and reporting on things that are going on within the government, then a lot more things can just kind of slide through without the public being aware of it. Another important check, I guess, on government power is the civil service. So I mentioned the size of government has grown a lot over the years. You might think of that as good or bad, but as the United States has grown, that's just kind of what has happened. And within those executive branches and sometimes offices with the judicial branch and legislative branches as well, there's lots of civil servants or bureaucrats that are just like the main people, like the heads of the different executive offices, the cabinet members, people like that are appointed by the president, but like there's lots of people underneath them that are just like, that's their career, is they specialize in a certain area like environment or public health or something, and they have a lot of expertise and they are there for their career, so they go through many different administrations. They're not like tied to any one political party. And I feel like that's a really important check on government, just having that body of people with expertise that like they don't have the incentive to like pander to any particular politician or party. Like they just want to do their job well, and they know that like in a few years' time there might be another president and they're still gonna want to keep their same job, if that makes sense. Anyway, and the third one I had to throw in because I used to work at the Federal Reserve Bank, but that one, I think it's interesting. Like the president is often judged based on the state of the economy, but like at least in my opinion, the president doesn't have that much direct control over the economy. The Federal Reserve Bank has much more power than the president, for sure. And the head of the Federal Reserve and the Board of Governors, so that's like kind of the leadership of the Fed, they are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But the rest of the Fed is completely independent politically. The central bank, the Fed, is not officially part of the government at all. It's like a quasi-governmental entity. And that's specifically so that they won't be influenced by short-term political pressures. You can imagine, like in some countries with central banks that are controlled by the government and that have much more people elected and can easily be removed or things like that, it can get really bad. Like presidents can just like order the central bank to just print more money when they want to print more money, or, you know, it can have really detrimental impacts on the economy. So I'm grateful that that branch it's not really part of the government, that it is separate from the rest of the government. That helps keep the economy much more stable. Okay. And just lastly, yeah, I think this is my last slide. Yep. Okay. So I think we have all been concerned, like looking at the potential for presidential overreach. And especially in this administration, there's now like President Trump and Congress is also controlled by Republicans, not by a very wide margin, but they do have control of the House and the Senate. And there have been a lot of Republican appointees to the judicial branch as well, to the Supreme Court. So it does kind of look like there's this potential for President Trump to overstep the bounds and like really push the limits of his power and do a lot of things and not really be checked by the other branches in the way that we would expect to happen. And yeah, kind of as I was researching this, it was interesting to look and realize like this isn't just President Trump. In recent decades, because I think Congress has become much more gridlocked because there's so much polarization, presidents from both parties, like since Obama, maybe also George W. Bush, they've tried to expand the limits of their power to achieve policy goals in pretty much any way that they could. And I mean, it's not unique to this era as well. Like there were other presidents like FDR and Lincoln for sure, like during wars and things like that, used the situation that they were in to take a lot of power on themselves. But yeah, it's definitely more noticeable today, I think, than it has been in quite a while. So some options. Well, I guess before I talk about that, so my point would be like, it's important to realize that many presidents have used these powers, and sometimes we might fully support what they did. Like, for example, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. And obviously, that was a really good thing to do. And eventually, that was passed into law by Congress. But I'm glad he didn't wait for Congress to figure that out in the middle of the Civil War before he issued that proclamation. So although we can get definitely scared when there's someone in power that we don't agree with, like, we do need to kind of take it with a grain of salt, because both parties and lots of different presidents have used these powers for different reasons. Some of them we might agree with, some of them we might disagree with. And I think definitely it's not a good idea for presidents to abuse this power and to be issuing tons and tons of executive orders and trying to step around Congress. But in certain situations, it might make sense for them to do it. Okay. Yeah. So kind of the two main options that I can think of for presidential power is like the executive orders that we've kind of talked about already, and also like emergency declarations. And Trump and other recent presidents have used both of these in sometimes questionable ways. So it was interesting. I was listening to a podcast recently that was talking about the spending freeze that President Trump tried to do this past week, that caused so much chaos and so many problems. Anyway, I was thinking that would definitely be kind of unconstitutional, right? Like, Congress is the one in charge of government spending, not the president. So I'm like, what is he doing? Like, this is crazy. But there was this podcast with these two lawyers discussing it, and it was actually pretty interesting to learn about. They said, like, there is actually quite a bit of leeway in terms of like kind of the timing and the way that presidents spend the money that's appropriated by Congress. So since it was just a temporary spending freeze, he might actually not be violating the Constitution for that. If he was to just say, we're not doing what Congress appropriated and we're never going to do it, then that would probably be a blatant violation of the Constitution. But it was interesting. They said that other presidents have actually done similar things to the spending freeze, just not so broadly, not like we're freezing almost everything or everything that I don't like. It just wasn't so like big and blatant. But like, for example, they talked about President Biden when he came into office. Like, I guess Congress had appropriated funds to build the border wall, and that those funds weren't used yet. And he did not want to build the wall on the border. So he didn't like issue this executive order and make a big deal about it like Trump did, but he tried to just kind of use whatever loopholes he could to just push it down the road as much as he could. So he kind of like stayed within those legal loopholes. So he would like say, oh, we need to delay it because we need to like do environmental studies to see what the environmental impact will be, or the safety impact, or different things. And he ended up like delaying it and delaying it and delaying it so much that he didn't end up spending the money at all for the 4 years he was in office, even though Congress had said he should spend that money. So that was interesting to me that like he tried to do it like within the legal loopholes that were available to him, whereas Trump is just kind of like trying to push the limits and just use his power as much as possible and see what works and what the court will allow him to do, where other presidents have been a little more sneaky about it, but have kind of done the same thing. Anyway, so that was interesting for me. I think clearly there's a lot of constitutional issues with some of the executive orders that Trump has done, particularly the birthright citizenship one, but others as well. And they're definitely, a lot of them are going to go to the Supreme Court or through the court system to kind of be decided if he has the power to do that or not. Yeah, some of them, like diversity, equity, and inclusion within the federal government, unfortunately, he probably does have the power to do that because he has power over like policies within the executive branch. So it's a little, I think it'll take a long time to figure out like what all these rulings will be and how much of these executive orders will actually go through and how many of them will be stopped by the courts. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. Other areas that I thought of where the president has pretty broad powers, and where some presidents have like done things that are kind of pushing the limits of their power. They can, even though Congress has the power to declare war, not the president, it's a little tricky because the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So there have definitely been times where the president has sent out troops before Congress officially declares war. And that can happen. Also, as we've seen, I just saw the news today that Trump has said he's going to impose tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China. The president does have pretty broad powers to impose tariffs. It's not entirely clear what the limits are on that between the president and Congress. So that is one area of the economy where the president does have some control, is with tariffs. And then also with immigration, there are certain instances where the president can limit immigration. And part of that, goes back to the emergency declarations. So Trump has used that before, and other presidents have used that as well. He famously used declared an emergency on the southern border in order to go ahead and start building the wall, even though Congress had not approved that yet. So presidents have definitely overstepped when it comes to declaring emergencies, but they can also use that to limit people coming into the country. That happened during COVID as well. And that emergency declaration stayed in place for quite a while after COVID had pretty much ended. So that caused problems with immigration as well at the southern border. So anyway, I hope this was helpful and gave a little more clarity to kind of what the powers of each branch is and how they work together.